It's that time. It's that time. Free Coaching Friday. Let's take a look. Let's see what's going on, because this is another one of the. There seems to be something big going on almost every week at this point. Just one of these days we'll slow down, but there's not much that's going to slow us down from trying to figure out new things to do on a 24/7 basis, because we are a DevSecOps company who teaches cybersecurity so that people can figure out how to do whatever they want with their world. And by whatever you want with your world, there's a reason why I titled this Free Coaching Friday basically claiming that hackers are the modern pioneers of this world. Because, you know, when you come from a hacker background, maybe that's the living that you made, maybe that's the thing that you found interest in, that you're trying to make a living in, whatever you're trying to do. Thing about people who are hacker types, because let's talk about hacker types. I just watched something called the Wild West Hack and Fest conference. And, you know, normally this conference was supposed to be a conference in person. But cybersecurity, we don't care where things are located. We're like, you know, we just do things online. And other people are trying to do conferences online and all that good stuff. But it's interesting hearing the cybersecurity community, especially the hacker community and the ethical hacker community, very specifically talk about, you know, all of the things that we're getting into and all of the things that are driving us and the community and all of that. And I do have to give some shout outs. One of my favorite people who, I don't know if anyone had the opportunity to watch the Wild West Hack and Fest conference. If you did, let me know, because it was a pretty good conference. But I'm gonna talk about some good things there. So for anyone who did make it, you'll notice there are people like one of my favorite people on the planet, Nadine Tanner. So wonderful speech from her today. She's actually part of our group. So thank you and congratulations. I thought it was an outstanding speech. If you watch this probably later in a recording, because you're probably sleeping by now. But the others who were talking, you know, we had ReliaQuest talking about cybersecurity. This is another cybersecurity company. There are people like Chris Roberts and Douglas Brush, and different people who have things to say about what's going on in the general world of cybersecurity. And without fail, the thing that just keeps coming up, no matter who you talk to, whatever expert you want to get into, there is one statement that was said that, you know, an expert in cybersecurity when they willingly just give away all of their information. They're like, I have nothing, I'll tell you whatever you want to know. Because, like, I don't have to try to hoard my knowledge, because I'm too busy trying to figure out the new thing to hack, because anything else is old news to me. That's the hacker mentality. So as hackers, you'll find that when you start to meet hackers, you'd go to talk to people who go to the Wild West Hack and Fest. We just give information away freely, just like I'm doing right now. It's just what we do. You go talk to a hacker type, go message one of these people. And if we have the time and we have the availability, because sometimes things get crazy, sometimes you just got to tell people how some stuff works so that some other people can do some stuff too. Because, I mean, it's kind of fun, if we're going to be honest. And another thing that everyone generally agrees on is skills. Skills matter. There's an interesting situation where there is discussion on tools and different types of tools. You know, firewall. A firewall is a cybersecurity tool. We have antivirus. We've talked about antivirus. You know, that's something that people have heard of. And then we have all these different types of things like file integrity monitoring. We have all these crazy things these days. And if we take a step back and talk to the experts, what they'll say is, we're still using the same tools. It's just that people keep adding new versions of the tool and then confuse everyone. So if we talk about like a firewall, you start with Checkpoint. There was a company called Checkpoint who started this thing called a firewall, and people are like, oh, you can like block ports and control incoming like network and internet traffic. You can do things to keep people out. Oh, sweet. And then, you know, antivirus came out and all these things. But we're still using these tools. The only difference is we have a billion flavors of the same thing. And if you look at all the different billion flavors of the same thing, these are cybersecurity tools. And so the tools, we see it in the industry. Those of us who've been around the industry see something that happens pretty often, is those who are newer to the industry tend to want to go and learn, okay, so I need to learn this firewall and that firewall. And they'll be like, okay, so should I learn Splunk or Logarithm or QRadar or, like which one of these flavors of this tool? Well, I'm not the only one saying this. Go talk to the rest of the hackers out there and the other purple teamers who do both red team and blue team and do all that stuff. And time again, all the tools are the same. A firewall is a firewall. I don't care if it's a software firewall. I don't care what, if it's a hardware firewall. But these are some things that, as hackers, we want to identify, if I look at a tool, if I'm looking at anything, any given tool, I want to know what does it do and what's it do differently from something else. And if I see the word firewall, I'm like, oh, it's a firewall. I'm not going to sit there and be like, oh, it's a checkpoint, or oh, it's a... They use ports, they do the same general things. Yeah, there are some minor differences, but if you focus on the differences, this is a mindset thing. So one thing I just want to say is, for those of you trying to become ethical hackers and you're trying to learn new technologies and you're trying to learn the new things, don't focus on individual like brands of things or different flavors of something. Just understand, if you're trying to learn one technology at a time, like a firewall, and you're trying to learn fundamentals or something like that, a firewall is a firewall. It doesn't matter how you learn it, and I'm going to talk about why I like using things like Raspberry Pis to teach that, because you can actually, without buying a firewall, you can just build a firewall if you have certain types of things. If you have a laptop, you can build a firewall on a laptop. You can build a firewall on a Raspberry Pi. And one of the things we've done is, because we use Raspberry Pis for our own technology, the reason why we use Raspberry Pis for our own technology is because if I don't have to buy a billion things to accomplish my cybersecurity goals, I can accomplish much more than someone who's a cybersecurity competitor. I might charge $500 an hour, but I don't have all these extra random things that I charge for if I'm working with like an enterprise. Because hacker types, you can keep your budget down with skills, and this goes back to DevSecOps. So if you have skills and you have skills to work with firewalls and all these things, you stop needing to go buy a firewall when you're trying to help a client or trying to help a company. And if you're trying to get hired at a company, companies want to hire the people who can do the things that will make them more money. And if they don't have to buy hardware and you can just fabricate things just out of your imagination, companies hire that. Companies hire the skill to fabricate things out of your imagination. And that's more or less what we call cybersecurity these days. Something that I do also want to get into as we're getting into this, I want to talk about our homework. We had homework last week for the first time. But if you're looking at my screen, we've been working on something, which is a little reason why I'm shuffling. It's been a very interesting week. That's the most I'll say about that. It's been a real interesting week. But all of that aside, we have been working on our tool suite because, we run a program called the Pi Hacker Experience. I'm always trying to teach people how to do things, and I'm always trying to teach people how to build stuff. You can build whatever you want with the Raspberry Pi, and right now I'm actually not going to showcase necessarily what these are yet, because we're going to talk about what these are. What I'm going to talk about is the fact that I'm a hacker. That's what I am. That's like career-wise, that's what I've done with my life, skill set, the things that I do, and that includes being able to just build my own products. And that's something that I like to talk to those about. Like, you look at the stuff that we do, any one of you can do anything that we do. If I fabricate an appliance, you can fabricate an appliance. Now, that doesn't mean that you can just do it without learning and practice and all those different types of things. I built an entire company myself, but once again, ethical hackers, you have the ethical hacker skills, then you can pretty much do whatever you want. Because how do you build a little appliance? You get a 3D printer. 3D printers are electronic and technical, and if you already got hacking skills, just make the machine make what you want. And there you go, done. And if you want to do a little bit of software engineering, you can do that. If you want to modify someone else's software, you can do that. If you want to understand how to get around the licensing issues on XYZ, then do the things that get you around licensing issues so that you can manufacture your own products. So now that's ethical hacking. And then if you're working for a company, like, these are the skills that companies are looking for these days, is can someone just kind of come up with whatever they want, like whatever a company wants or needs to provide for a service or provide for a customer, or to train people, like how can we train people more affordably, things like that. So one of the things that we're doing is we are just putting together things for companies to basically be able to support their staff a little better. And also for those of you who are trying to get into cybersecurity, we're creating tools for you to learn with too, for that matter. So if you want to learn all this stuff, you can pretty much take a look at what we're doing and then also ask us questions, and we will talk about how you can learn all of the different types of things. But we are indeed now at the point where we will begin selling our own kits for those of you who are developers, developer kits for those of you who are trying to learn how to build your own cybersecurity tools. This is a thing we've been working on for quite some time, and it's important to me to deliver on the things that I talk about, so I just want everyone to know that it's almost here. For those of you who do want to know more about these, we are actively in the process of getting ready to distribute these. So if you want to get on a waiting list before we start trying to figure out other ways, feel free to talk to me. Our CTO, his name is Jordan Anderson. He's awesome. He's the one who makes these, and he is far, far away. And something to know about these cases is they have these little like removable faceplates, so you can have interchangeable cases with different color faceplates and things like that. And at some point we'll make it to where people can have their own company logos on things for if a company's trying to train their staff and stuff like that. But the thing is, we are trying to do everything we can to make it easier for people to be able to develop whatever they're trying to develop, engineer whatever they're trying to engineer. And these days, I've talked about this in past Free Coaching Fridays and past events, but Microsoft is making it so that if you are using a Raspberry Pi or a few Raspberry Pis, you can integrate them with their Azure cloud. So you can develop on a Raspberry Pi and then have it deploy into a $40 billion cloud, which is just how it works. It's called DevSecOps. That's something that is possible, and with a Raspberry Pi you can produce things that you can home lab and then deploy into clouds and build tools that giant companies use, all with this tiny little thing right here. And so as you can see, we have like little faceplates that we're developing for that, because we want to make it easier for people to develop tools, to develop things that are going to allow them to succeed. So something else that I want to talk about is our homework from Free Coaching Friday. We had some homework. What our homework was to see if you could get Steam running on a Raspberry Pi. Now, I'm going to give everyone a cheat on this one. And so your new homework is, I'll ask right now, I don't know, because I didn't specify a specific time. Whenever I don't specify a specific time for when Free Coaching Friday is, we get fewer people who are able to make it, which makes complete sense. It's just been a very crazy week, so we couldn't really operate the way that we normally operate due to circumstances. But all things aside, for those who are actively here, if anyone did do the homework, go ahead and let me know. And also, hello everyone for who's in here. But yeah, if anyone has, let's see, I'm just seeing if anyone has any immediate questions. Went down a deep rabbit hole. So it doesn't look like anyone necessarily completed getting that working yet. So I'm going to give everyone a cheat code real quick to play with for this week, because this goes back to what I was saying is one of my favorite ways to hack. And why are we using Raspberry Pis in the first place? Because it's a really standardizable platform that's affordable for folks. So I try to recommend people use things that are easy to access and get a hold of, get your hands on. There is a special operating system called Twister OS. I think it's twisteros.com. Yeah, this is the one. This website looks a little odd. For those on the YouTube side, I'll put this link in somewhere later. But for those in Facebook, I'm going to give you this, what's called Twister OS, and I'll talk about this real quick. So last week, I had given homework for the first Free Coaching Friday ever, and I was talking about hacking hardware. Any hardware can be hacked. You can get things to work. So to recap, because some of you are new here, so welcome for the first time, and I appreciate you jumping on. So just to review for those of you who are new in here, basically something that most people don't necessarily know is if you're working on a laptop or you're working on a desktop computer, or maybe there's a company and that company has servers. Well, ultimately, we install software on hardware and so on and so forth, but when we write software, anytime we write software, it has to be written for a certain type of hardware with certain type of encoding is what you could call it. And the way that that usually works is, for those of you who have heard of companies like Intel, AMD, or Raspberry Pi uses one called ARM. These are the processor chips that computers generally use. Well, because most companies use Intel and AMD, because historically ARM is something that you see in cell phones or like Raspberry Pis, and up until last year, Raspberry Pis weren't powerful enough to really use as desktop computers. So, people don't use ARM computers, so developers didn't code software, and this includes Steam. Steam was not coded to work on a Raspberry Pi because a Raspberry Pi does not use Intel processors, and a Raspberry Pi does not use AMD processors. It uses its own kind of random hardware from a company called ARM that got bought out by NVIDIA for $40 billion in the month of September, which is pretty crazy. So when we do start getting into, the hardware compatibility issues, I gave everyone the homework to see if you could figure out how to get Steam installed on a Raspberry Pi. And while I've done it before, there's an easier way to install Steam on a Raspberry Pi. And I'm going to give everyone some reverse engineering homework because one of the number one questions I've gotten this week, and there's someone in particular who I'm going to go send this video to later on so that you can do some reverse engineering, is there's Twister OS. I'm going to recommend to all of you hackers out there who are learning how to make things work with hardware they shouldn't be working on, is Twister OS has Steam running on a Raspberry Pi, and it shouldn't be compatible. It shouldn't work. And this is part of the learning process of understanding, how do you work with this new processor type? How do you work with this type of hardware and make different types of software work on things that they shouldn't work on? I want you to learn how to make things do things that they should not do. Just straight up. Steam simply shouldn't run on a Raspberry Pi. Go try it. Go install Raspberry Pi OS and try to install Steam. You can even install Windows 10 on a Raspberry Pi. Microsoft actually made it compatible. Steam's not generally going to work very well, but Twister OS, take that, install it on your Raspberry Pi, and your Raspberry Pi is going to have Steam running on there, and you can take a look at how in the world did they get that running. And really, it's a pretty remarkable thing to look at, and you'll see what else they did with Twister OS. It's a pretty remarkable operating system to reverse engineer. So this is going to be everyone's first opportunity where I'm not just going to give you homework this week. It's going to be reverse engineering homework, and I just want everyone to take some time, and I'll say this at the end of the session as well, to take a look at Twister OS, reverse engineer it, and see how in the world did they get Steam running on there. So that's what I'm going to say about that for now. But getting into pioneering here. So when we're talking about hacking stuff, some other stuff that's rather interesting, getting into the hardware bits. When you really start trying to understand what's going on with a system, whether you're trying to learn ethical hacking, some of these other things. Once again, I was at a Wild West Hackin' Fest, and it just got me thinking about all these different things. And one of those things that I really want to talk about is, I keep talking about, you can build products, right? You can build products somehow on a Raspberry Pi. How does that make any sense? I never really talk about how you can do these things. And if you're working at a company, it's the same skill to build products for a company as well. So if a company hires you, they're like, hey, we need someone who can build software firewalls, or we need someone who can at least work with software firewalls, do the debugging on them, and help them do implementation and, continuous implementation, all these crazy things. There's a skill involved in knowing how that might work. So right here, I've talked about NEMS OS as well. So this part's not homework. This is now me just getting into. So you've got reverse engineering homework. Download Twister OS. Take a look at what Twister OS is and see how in the world did they get Steam running on Twister OS. That's the homework. But now we're going back to just kind of talking about development and taking hardware to turn it into something. How do we take hardware and turn it into something more than just like what? A Raspberry Pi is a PCB, just like a little set of chips, right? It might as well be a brick. So how do we make a Raspberry Pi more than a brick? So one of the things I've been using a lot lately is it's called NEMS Linux. NEMS Linux is a flavor of Linux it's really great for using with hardware. So I use it with hardware hacking. You can use it for developing SIM, security information event management, all these crazy things. You can do all kinds of stuff with NEMS Linux. And we can take a look at what the general clock frequency, because I do hardware hacking on here. So one of the things that I've done is I've hacked this hardware to run at a 2.0 overclock. So overclocking is a form of hacking. So if you want to optimize a system, I like using Raspberry Pis, because what if you want to create something where it requires a computing system, like if you wanted to create a tool like something that works with like Splunk. A Raspberry Pi doesn't really have the power to work with a tool like Splunk. Not really. A Raspberry Pi, if you know what clock speeds are, I'll say the clock speeds for those of you who know that, but its default clock speed is a 1.5, and for those of you who don't know what that means that the Raspberry Pi 4 isn't a very fast machine. It's fast enough, it has like 4 processing cores for those of you who know what that is, but it's not the fastest thing on the planet. But guess what? It can be overclocked by at least 25% for how small that thing is. Now that's a big deal, because then we have this little tiny thing, and right here I'm showing I ran a test, is my Raspberry Pi overclocking stably? And are the clocks running at rates that are consistent? Is it having any weird like power anomalies? If I'm going to, take a Raspberry Pi and try to do something with it, especially for an enterprise, especially for a company, and I'm going to make a business out of it, I probably want to make sure that whatever I'm making works. And I want to make sure that it's probably stable. And so, since I've been talking about hardware hacking lately, and if cybersecurity people are the pioneers of technology, if we're talking about like hackers, because what does a hacker do? A hacker takes something and then makes whatever they want with it. And so I'm going to talk about how, as a hacker, you can take something and make whatever you want with it, because that's what pioneers do, right? If you're a pioneer, you're going to go and look for something to explore. You're going to try to find something that maybe no one really understands yet. And you're going to scratch your head and try to figure it out, because that's why we're here. That's the only reason we're here, is to figure something out that no one's been able to figure out. And so if people are trying to come up with ways to have more affordable services, cheaper services, and they're trying to figure out who to hire, and right now the layoffs have been laid thick and heavy. Why? Because companies don't even know how to develop cybersecurity tools and implement cybersecurity in a way that even they can afford. How come I can afford to do cybersecurity stuff when all these other companies are just laying everyone off and can't afford to do business? You can come up with your own stuff. And actually, you don't even have to pay to come up with your own stuff. You just have to have some imagination and pull your sleeves up a little bit and just kind of come up with some things and call some people on the phone and be like, hey, I have some thoughts. What do you think? And then when you start talking to people, then they're going to say, well, you should try to do this thing. You're like, I bet if I had this kind of hardware, I could probably figure that out, because that's what a hacker does. So anyways, I have boosted this thing in these little graphs right here. You might not know what this graph is showing, but this is showing that my little boost to give the Raspberry Pi that I'm working with right here more power, at least 25% more power, so that this thing can now be used for me to create a product, right? Something that's going to let me be able to run my business, so that I don't need to go hire someone or go, buy some super expensive firewall. Now, I've got a few hardware firewalls floating around here, but I don't actually need them, because I have everything that I have right here, where I can just go and build whatever I want. Now, if you're just trying to learn, that's another reason why you might just go build a firewall from a Raspberry Pi. Why? Well, because then you'll know how to build a firewall. And if companies are trying to hire people who at least know how to work with firewalls, you better believe that they want to know that if you can build a firewall from ground up, no one else that they know can do that. But that's what hackers do. So, as a hacker, I want you to think outside of the box. I want you to think so far as, what are some things that I can just like fabricate? Well, let me show you how to fabricate something. Because today is all about fabrication, because that's what pioneers are going to do. We're going to go look for something. We're going to go mine for something new. So I've been talking about Docker a lot, and if I have a Raspberry Pi that now has the speed to do all the things that I want to do. And it shows right here, this shows voltages. You can see I've got a few power dips and stuff like that, but overall it shows that my power has been pretty stable and consistent over the past couple of days that this thing's been running and all that good stuff. So let's go over to Docker Hub over here, and let's see what happens if we just say, I've talked about Docker before, and for those who are new, I might talk a little more about Docker after I get into this, but Docker is this awesome tool where you can install Docker on a laptop, Raspberry Pi, desktop. I don't care what kind of computers. You can install it in the cloud. Docker is an application. You install it on a computer, and Docker is this weird application that lets you kind of build little tiny like software computers as a way that you could look at them, called containers. And containers, if you've ever heard of a virtual machine, they almost work like virtual machines. Almost work like virtual machines. But anyways, if I go to Docker, has this thing where if you install that software, they let you just go and download things. You can download Ubuntu, or I don't even know how you probably pronounce Ubuntu, but Ubuntu, I have no idea. But you can put that in a little container on, say, a Raspberry Pi, and then that Raspberry Pi can talk to the little container, and you can put whatever you want in the container. But what if you wanted a Raspberry Pi to suddenly have something a little interesting like a firewall? Oh, here we go. So I just typed firewall in Docker Hub, and Docker Hub has something that's a little interesting, is it has all these things are called images, for those of you who aren't familiar with Docker. And if I go, and this says new vector, container security, complete security, container platform. If I just click on this, it says it's Docker certified. It says scan during build and protect containers. Now, this is not anything promotional. I actually have no idea who this company is, but I'm just showing you, like, if I'm going to go and try to build a firewall, how you can just randomly go build a firewall. It says, think of New Vector as a cloud-native container firewall plus more. Oh, great. Well, not only is it a firewall, it has even more than a firewall. So I can just go install Docker and then install this, and then put a few other things that I want on there. Bam! I now have a firewall. I have a Raspberry Pi firewall. It's a product. I can package it. I can put it in one of these cases here and put a little. There we go. Bam! Bam! Now I have a firewall. Everyone. Product production 101. This is how you produce a product. It's one of many ways. Obviously, it doesn't even have to be a physical appliance. It could be like a service that you end up developing, or a web app, or something along those lines. But this is the modern world, and this is what's happening, where a lot of companies, historically, with them working with cybersecurity, they have to spend millions of dollars, thousands of dollars on things like getting firewall assets and all of that stuff. Nowadays, if you just have skills, the skills can be the part that companies pay for, because skills can just fabricate this stuff. And that's the new world. If you got skills, make whatever you want. If you're a hacker, then you got skills. And if you're not yet a hacker, then just start doing stuff. Go get a Raspberry Pi, or go grab your existing laptop, install Docker on that thing. Maybe even try discovering what virtual machines are if you don't know what that is. Go and create yourself a firewall. Now, there's a lot more that goes into it, because I'll tell you right now that this one probably isn't pre-built to work on a Raspberry Pi right away. This one would need a little bit of legwork, this new vector right here. Because last week I was talking about architectures, and all these items have these little tags down here. And these little tags that say, let's see where my mouse is, where it says container Linux x86, these mean something. And right here, this one says ARM64. So this firewall clash, this would work on a Raspberry Pi, but this is another element that you'd have to learn about technology. So yeah, so this is more or less, this is what's called security as code. I've talked about security as code before, But when we're talking about, continuous deployment, continuous development, continuous implementation, all these different types of things, you can create, a test environment, a production environment, and then just, you can set up pies that you send to a customer and then manage their entire company off of a bunch of pies. So, getting a little further down this rabbit hole, this is just kind of cracking a little deeper under the surface than I've cracked before when we're talking about, because I say this all the time. I'm like, oh yeah, just pick up the skills. You can get products. Yeah, but what kinds of products can you just randomly make? But I do say that if you are one of those, I had one student, one of my first students who basically made me realize that building your own products gets you a job better than just like certifications or anything, was I told them to build Splunk in a Docker container, and they did just like this. And they're like, oh yeah, I have a SIM in a container. And then just that by itself got them a job. They're like they got a job right away. Not only did they get a job, but they got to create their own job, because someone else kind of was like, hey, we don't have a job position open, but we saw that you did this thing. Can we create a job position for you? Because companies are desperate for this. And I was at Wild West Hackin' Fest, and companies are desperate for these things, because it's never been possible for us to use containerization to create products like this. Because, I mean, realistically, even the Raspberry Pi, like the old models, they weren't powerful enough to do all this. Not this. Not like this. But now that we do have more affordable, like, hardware that's easily standardizable, that's heavily, like, widely adopted, you don't even have to use Raspberry Pis for things. But the thing about Raspberry Pi is it's widely adopted and it's heavily supported. And businesses like to have things that are heavily supported, because if you try to go Google your problems and there's no Google answer, Raspberry Pi has endless answers to your Googles. As to our other platforms, like there's a ton of like Pi platforms, and there's the Jetson Nano and all these things. For businesses who don't have like a lot of talent in-house, they don't want to have something that they can't Google what to do when everything goes wrong. So I focus on Raspberry Pi for that reason. I have had people ask, why do you focus on Raspberry Pi when there's more powerful little platforms? It's just because the community support matters. Community support to me is a very important thing, and the Raspberry Pi has invested a whole lot into the community support, and they just have a wonderful community. So I'm a community person. I think community is the best, and I like to support anything that's associated with community and focusing on the people. So I support Raspberry Pi because I support that, and then they also make it just easy to work with what they have. But yeah, you don't have to work with the same like hardware that I prefer to work with. It's just I target things like affordability and stuff like that. I do have some other questions that people ask that I'll ask a little later. But does anyone have any questions about, I guess, this concept? Of course, this is just Free Coaching Friday, so it doesn't get as deep as we could with some things. But any questions before we get a little further into some of this? Probably no questions yet. Not that I see anyways. And sometimes I don't always see the chats until late, which I apologize for some of you. Oh, man. So I had a big question, and it was about, I get this question sometimes, like, what do people do in the military? Which is kind of a funny question, but really though, if you do military work, what does military work involve, and what does military cyber work mean? The first thing that I will just say about military work is it's compliance heavy, and I am immediately going to go over to something called NIST. And then someone does have a question. Yeah, go ahead and ask your question. I'm happy to answer. And in the meantime, so while you're typing that, so for NIST, if you ever just type this in your search bar, you look at where it says National Institute of Standards and Technology, this is a foundation. Oh yeah, and then a question here says, do we need Docker to get started on a firewall? You don't need Docker to get started on a firewall. Really, that's a good question. Let me actually draw out a diagram, because that's a really good question. So let's draw a diagram of building a firewall with a piece of hardware, and we're going to use a Raspberry Pi as the example. So if I say it could be any hardware, really. It doesn't have to be a Raspberry Pi, but we just have to have some hardware. I'm just going to use this as a Raspberry Pi hardware. And let's say that we have networking plugged into it. So we have, draw a little line here. If it'll let me draw. Come on, thing. Might have to refresh this. Oh, there it goes. You all saw that. It just magically appeared. Alright, let me just start this over. Okay, it's gonna work this time. So if I have a Raspberry Pi and we are connecting this thing to the network, so like let's just say that this is a modem. We'll even label it modem. And this is me oversimplifying it. You'd probably have it connected to a router too, but nonetheless, you have to have it connected to a modem. And believe it or not, there's something called a banana Pi that has extra like little ports on it. You can build a router out of. You can build a router out of a Raspberry Pi, now that I think about it. But so yeah, you can just plug a modem straight into a Raspberry Pi. You'll have to figure out how you want to organize like USB add-ons for networking and all that good stuff. But on the Raspberry Pi, in order to have a firewall, let's just represent the firewall here as orange. So in order for us to mash a firewall onto a Raspberry Pi, all we need really is software. So we can just put the firewall on the Raspberry Pi directly, but let me tell you why Docker. If we just take a Raspberry Pi and then we just install a firewall on a Raspberry Pi, let's say that, especially if you're doing business, there will be something that'll crash one day, something that'll fail one day, or work that you don't want to have to do again someday. So let's say that something happens to this firewall. Let's say that something happens to this Raspberry Pi, and who knows what. I'm just going to put an X through it. Let's say anything happens to it. It just burns out one day or fries or whatever. Well, if you instead take the firewall and let me show you a little trick. Let's say instead you install Docker. And here's why Docker. And you could use Kubernetes instead, but Kubernetes uses Docker. So I'll say to everyone who doesn't know the difference between Kubernetes and Docker is that in terms of like building with them, it's kind of similar and they're interchangeable. So you can use Kubernetes or Docker. You could just think about it that way. Usually it's like which one is a company using? Right now a lot of companies like Kubernetes, but we use both. So let's say that we then take Docker. Docker lets you take software and then package it so that it's sitting on top, like in Docker, where if for whatever reason, for any reason, let's say that this Raspberry Pi hardware just tanks. Well, if you have Docker, you can have this Docker up here, then port it over to new hardware. So let me just duplicate this and say duplicate. So if we look at it like this, then if that hardware dies, then we can set it up to where the Raspberry Pi, now this is where we start to get into what's called continuous development. Now I teach DevSecOps. This is the continuous portion of it to where the firewall, if a firewall goes down, internet goes down. So firewalls are a type of technology that we just don't want a firewall to go down. If the firewall goes down for a company, let's say that you're at Walmart and Walmart's local firewall goes down, and you're trying to swipe your stuff and buy your groceries, and let's say that there's 300 people in the Walmart that you're at that exact moment, that you're at least 300, maybe more, who knows, might be a super Walmart. All of a sudden their primary firewall system goes out. Until that firewall system comes back up, no one can buy anything. Everything's down. That's why you don't want your firewall to go down, because that firewall goes down, there goes all the money that's paying for the people who work on the firewall and all that good stuff. So like, you just can't let the firewall go down, because then all those people, like, people wait for so long, and then there go all the customers. They're like, well, there goes that day of so like, now Walmart has a lot of money, so they can eat, budget. But if it's like a medium-sized company, or have mercy on a small shop, and they just so happen to have like a big launch, and it was the day that they needed to get all the major funding, that can be a bankrupt company right there. Company's firewall goes out on the wrong day, bankrupt. They're like, they lost their sales for the day for something really like devastating for a business that's not like a giant mega corporation. Devastating. You can't let that happen. And so that's why DevSecOps matters. You have to have ways to keep technology, continuous technologies, because a firewall needs to be continuously develop them. So then you can even do things like, let's say you wanted to set it up to where you have 2 Raspberry Pis that work together. Let me erase some of these things. So let's get rid of this X right here. And it sounds like someone's car alarm is going off, so sorry if there's a car alarm noise. Car alarms. Let's see. So let's now take a look at updating this scenario to say that instead, let's say that we start with 2 Raspberry Pis. This is actually why we very specifically use 2 Raspberry Pis on our primary development. Let's say that you do it like this, where this is what's called building a Docker swarm. So then we can call this this is clustering right here. So now we say, let's put that firewall in a Docker swarm cluster with not just 1, but 2 or more Raspberry Pis. All of a sudden, 1 Raspberry Pi goes down, and then the whole swarm can just say, oh, not a big deal, let's just fail over and just run on the one while you fix this hardware over here that just randomly just went down. And maybe you don't even know why this one over here went down. Maybe no one has any idea why this one went down. Or better yet, let's say that a company started getting too big for just 2. And you're like, oh man, we've been getting more employees, and it's like, do we have to like take down the internet and start to scale up our hardware and try to figure? No, you don't have to do anything crazy like that. You can just say, you know what, because we're using Docker, we can just come in here and we can just add more to the cluster and just keep building on top of it. And that's right. This is how we start building redundancy. And this is continuous development. So this is getting into DevSecOps related bits. And so by doing this, let's say that a company let's say that you start off helping a company. You give them a 2 Pi setup, and you're like, we're going to come in, we're going to give you a 2 Pi setup and do all your security on these Pis. Or let's say that you work at a company and they do this with servers. Everything that I'm talking about on Pis, people do this with servers, just normal old servers. So it's nothing new, it's just that Pis make it a lot more affordable than paying for a $2,000 server when you can have these things. Don't pay for the $2,000 server, maybe. Not in 2020, maybe in 2018, yes. But 2020, we can change that. So anyways, let's say that suddenly this company starts getting really big really fast, and they really need a lot more hardware than these little dinky Pis, because Pis, compared to something for like 1,000 employees, all of a sudden, they're not going to support that. That's crazy. So a cool thing about this is by using Docker, we can also say, we can duplicate this, and then we can throw it to synchronize with the cloud. So let's see, send this to the back. So this right here, then all of a sudden we have that same swarm, and it can basically just like, you can use tools like Azure Arc. A lot of this is getting into the newer technologies, so this is starting to get into some of the more modern stuff. Yeah, so, some good comments there is sometimes you want to deal with rolling back updates and things like that. Let's say that you do have a bad update on a system. By having a continuous development format, this is a good insight from one of the members, is, yeah, like, you want to be able to roll back bad patches and updates and, you know, have different ways to keep your systems running and keep them working effectively and keep them healthy. And basically you can just keep scaling and scaling and scaling and scaling and scaling these days. And you don't have to start with anything more than something simple, not anymore. And so, you know, it's just a thing. It's the modern world. So that's what's going on with, you know, how can you build a firewall, and then why Docker? Because that is a good question. You know, do you need Docker to build a firewall? It's not that you need Docker, you need hardware to build a firewall. And as long as you have the right hardware, that's all you need to build a firewall. And then Docker is something that you can just throw together. And so that's when we start to like pack all of this together, and then we have something that's pre-packaged. And this is why I'd like everyone to go look at reverse engineering Twister OS, because Twister OS is pre-packaged, and you can see, you know, what did someone do to package code. And so a firewall living in a container, now that's security as code, but you know, Twister OS, that's not necessarily security as code, but that's hacking hardware, where there's a lesson to be learned with, hey, how did they get the code to work with that hardware? And that's a big question, because if you can get code that shouldn't work on a piece of hardware to work on a piece of hardware that it's not compatible with, that's one of the most valuable skills on the planet, bar none. Everyone wants things to just fabricate and you know, be like, is it possible to make our own appliances? Yes, everyone can go and buy a 3D printer. Now there's different ones. You have to do all of the research on the different types of materials. You have to figure out what types of heads and bits and things. But guess what? Build those skills. You can do whatever you want. Like, sky's the limit, quite frankly. And that's a really wonderful thing. So, I mean, that's the thing that I've been getting carried away with lately. So, yeah, very good questions. And then I can get into the boring stuff, like, you know, what do they actually do in the military? That's a very weird and boring question, but it's an important one because a lot of people wonder. I'm going to say check out something called NIST.gov, because more than military, most of the world uses this foundation called NIST. So if you're in the Facebook group, I'll go ahead and drop that in the chat for, you know, what is NIST? Why do we care about NIST? Almost all standards around the world, Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, I don't know about Japan, probably Japan. I need to look back at that. That's a question that I have, because for those who are Japanese, if you have any thoughts on, do you know if your compliances are related to some of these international compliances, or do you work with some of those international I'm curious about that one myself, actually. But like, if we're talking about like Australian signals and stuff like that, it's based off of NIST. There's a whole bunch that are based off of NIST around the world. There's one called, there's just a lot. And as you can see, NIST, it has regulations for how we manage advanced communications, advanced manufacturing, cybersecurity, forensic science, all this good stuff. And this is where a lot of my foundational knowledge comes from too, because I used to build analytics and intelligence for working with NIST and NIST analytics. And so regardless of where in the world, we would always use NIST as a guideline. So if it's military, if it's something else, it's really dry, but you can learn everything about what they want just basically on this website, and then you can take a look at where it says things like cybersecurity framework and all of this stuff. Basically, if you start learning this stuff, you'll be able to self-teach yourself all of the primary, most important things that the military generally follows. There's more to it than that. And then if companies are trying to get, like, let's say that someone wants to get into FBI. I'm just going to say this one because the FBI is hiring a lot lately. And if anyone wants to work for the US FBI, then let's see, there's something called FedRAMP. And most people don't even know what FedRAMP is. But like if you wanted to go work for FBI, no one knows what FedRAMP is. And everyone wants someone to know what FedRAMP is because they must abide by FedRAMP by law. It's not even a choice. It's like, oh, okay. So who follows FedRAMP? Federal agencies, cloud service providers. So if you want to work with cloud service providers, agencies, FBI, third-party assessment organizations, all this good stuff, get into FedRAMP. Because FedRAMP, it's so specific, it's so niche, and it's kind of dedicated into... I'll put a link to what FedRAMP is too in the chat. About Us. You can click on the About Us page, all that good stuff. Or let's see, program overview. So anyways, like I used to build the intelligence analytics models that these things use, all that good stuff. FedRAMP's goals. I mean, you can go to their website and learn so much. You can get authorized for FedRAMP. So you can go in here and get a agency authorized would be what I'd recommend if you wanted to go work for like the Federal Bureau of Investigations or something along those lines. And that, of course, you got to make sure that you pass all the other things to work for certain types of entities and businesses and things like that. But this is not necessarily military, but that's like FBI. And then military does follow, like, a lot of them have their own compliances. So you could look up like DoD compliance. But ultimately, this is the high-level answer to that question of like, what do they do in the military? Notice if I type DoD compliance for like Division of Defense, it says DoD compliance NIST. You want to work in national defense, learn NIST. That's what I'm going to say. And the cool thing about it is you can just click on some of these. Let's see, compliance group. Well, let's just say NIST 800-171. I'll give everyone a document real quick. Why not? I'll give everyone in the group a document. Let's just say PDF. If you just look up like PDFs for these things, you can actually just look up like NIST 800-171 PDF, and then on their own .gov website, you can click on it, and bam, here it is. You can to your heart's content learn everything you want about these regulations, and as you can see, it's the most exciting thing you've ever seen. Okay, so for Japan, it's NISC. Good to know. That's good to know. So, you know, if you're US based or Australia or Singapore or some of these other regions, I think NISC, that probably impacts the federal trade for Singapore too, and other regions. The federal trade, at least. I don't even know about the rest of the country. But anyways, let me copy this for those who are interested, at least in reading through this, because someone's going to look at this and be like, wow, this is amazing. I'm going to read every single word in here. I'm going to learn everything that the military needs and wants. I'm going to obsess over this for days and don't even know why. This is how I learned most of the things that I know. I actually did get real obsessed, and then I worked with a whole bunch of auditors, and I used to build the code and automation for the auditors. I'm like, oh, so you need this thing to automate for this. And they'd be like, yeah, but no one knows how to do it. And I'm like, oh, I'll do it. So then I go automate the next one, and I go automate the next one. You know, it'll tell you like what kind of firmware do companies need. It'll tell you everything. So let me like zoom in on this real quick so you can take a look at a sample of like what do these things talk about. Firmware, computer program. It defines what firmware is, you know, so that you know, when it's saying that you need to update firmware, it makes sure that you're not thinking of the wrong thing, and it makes sure that you're not mistaking the wrong hardware. The physical components of a system, see software and firmware. Believe it or not, from a legal standpoint, these definitions right here are critical. If a military situation comes up or a government situation comes up and someone tries to use a defense point where they don't follow these definitions precisely, then the suit will be thrown out. So language, when you're doing this sort of thing, is actually like, it has to be measurably precise, for better or for worse. Whether people like it or not, it's just the nature of the beast. You have to be so precise with every single one of these little tiny things. And then you have what are called controls. So like this one right here, this is how dry this is. You'll look in here and be like, okay, so we need to know what the security requirements are. Oh, great. So we need to know all of the security requirements. So we need to employ cryptographic mechanisms to protect the confidentiality of remote access sessions. That's exactly how you know what a company needs. So I now know that every single company on the planet that must abide by this number right here, which is a lot of companies, or at least enough to matter, especially government, they must employ cryptographic mechanisms to protect confidentiality. So you'd better learn some cryptography. And there you go. That's how you know what skills people need. You know what skills people need by just actually looking at the list. You can find direct lists, and this is what I prefer doing over like a lot of things. It's just like, okay, so what does this company do? Oh, this company follows this compliance. Let me Google that compliance. Oh, I can pull up a PDF of the list of exactly what they're looking for. I'm going to take that knowledge into an interview. I can take this knowledge into an interview and blow people away. Like, yeah, we follow NIST 871. Okay, go read that for the week before your interview. Walk into the interview, that people will be like, how do you know all this? So anyways, that's what people do, like military-wise. I could get a lot further into it. Some things that I will say is, if you want to do military work, for those of you who are interested in it and asking about it, the easiest way to get into doing military work is, enlistment for sure, but you can actually do civilian military work, and you can actually go get hired at companies that are civilian-based companies, like, Logarithm's one. They even have it on their website. I can talk with Logarithm. I have to be careful what I talk about because confidentiality clauses and things, but I can talk about like things that they publicly put on their website. So that's just an example. Go find a company that has on their website that they work with government entities, and that's a civilian way to work with military. So if I just go to logarithm.com, then I scroll down. Most companies do this, where they just show the companies that they're allowed to represent and things like that. So it's like, I worked at Logarithm for a long time and have developed a bunch of things. So, that's developing technology for Air Force, if you really want to get into it. If you have what's called a security clearance, you can do a lot more. NASA's one, so, I did some work with NASA's intelligence and all that good stuff. There's different ones. There we go. Booz Allen, that's another one. So some other civilian companies that do military. Booz Allen. And actually, I got some training from Booz Allen, too. They're great. If anyone wants to know, learn a lot about data science, Booz Allen is an awesome entity to work for if you want to work with some outstanding scientists. So we can look at, let's see, Insights Markets. They have all this information in here, but you can look at some of these different companies and take a look at, if you look enough, and dig around in here, you'll find, their testimonials and things like that. Let's see, About Us, Heritage, Innovation. Oh, here we go, awards and recognition. This will have information on who works with them. When you're trying to get hired at a company, try to find out who their customers are before getting hired there. That's a secret to getting negotiations that win. Before interviewing at companies, go look on their website and find out who their clients are. And usually you can find it out just straight up from their website. It's awesome. And there's some other ones. I'm gonna go ahead and pull that up to you. So many good websites. So some other companies, I'm just gonna put this in here, is Northrop Grumman. Just more ways to get involved with civilian military, if that's really something that you wanted to do. Thanks for the tips, everyone. Because like I said, I've been getting a lot of questions about this sort of thing, and you don't necessarily let me put it this way. I am very, very disabled. I'm so disabled that I did not qualify. Like, I wanted to work for the Air Force once upon a time. I can't. But you know what? I can, and I have, because I learned that you can do stuff as a civilian, even if you're heavily disabled or have all these things and don't qualify. You don't have to qualify to work with, you know, military. And that would have been hilarious. If someone ever rickrolls me, I will send you something friendly, because that's a job well done. If you don't know what a rickroll is, I'm not going to tell you here, because I don't want you to win. But I'm just going to say it. If you rickroll me, I'll come up with something to give you. Successfully. That'd be hilarious. But yeah, so anyways, hopefully that kind of answers the question of, like, you know, can you work in the military without having, you know, a top clearance or top security? Yeah, you can. Can you work with military stuff with, you know, disabilities and weird things? Yes, you can. Can you work with the military without enlisting? Yes, you sure can. Does the military pay well? They generally pay civilians better than if you actually work not as a civilian for the military. That's not true in all the cases, but in many cases it is. So you know, there's some options, and I just wanted you all to know about that. So anyways, before I melt everyone's faces off too much, I just wanted to talk about, you know, things like options and different types of job things, answer people's questions for the week. I did get some other questions of for those who are in your 30s or older. I've gotten questions, you know, is it too late? Are you too old to switch into cybersecurity? No. Cybersecurity is one of those fields that age doesn't matter. I'm going to say it. Like, as long as you have the aptitude, that's the only thing that matters. I've had people who are, you know, in their 40s, you know, never had a cybersecurity job, and this is true, just take their existing experience from somewhere else and transition it into a senior level cybersecurity job, like even in their 40s. You don't have to start over in cybersecurity, because a lot of cybersecurity has elements from other industries, especially social engineering. If you have social engineering experience or networking experience or IT experience, you're like, really, like I said, you're just not too old to get into it if you have the aptitude. Usually you can tell if you have the aptitude. If you can't figure out how to navigate to Free Coaching Friday, this might not be the career for you, because it's on YouTube and it's also on Facebook. And then if you can't figure out how to hit play on something or all that stuff, then that's where the overhead might be too much. But if you can use, like, you know, navigate to things and all that stuff, you don't actually have to be technical in every cybersecurity role. Some are ultra technical, but a lot of them it's like management. Let's say that, like, engineers need managers too, and most engineers don't want to be managers. This is something you'll notice if you work in the space. Most of the super technical types, they want to just be super technical types. They're like, why would I want to be a manager? And then they'll go be a manager and be like, I'm not going to keep doing this. And then they go back to doing what they like. And then managers, they'll try to get into the technical and be like, and then most managers, it's just people either prefer working with people or they prefer working with machines. So it doesn't mean that you have to be like, technical kung fu ninja building firewalls out of Docker. You know, you just build some leadership skills and you can be a manager in the space as well. And it's not a bad career to be a manager. You can become a CISO without ever knowing how to actually, like, hack things or code stuff or do any blue team or red team. So it just kind of comes down to, like, what are your personal interests? So hopefully that answers the question for those, because I've actually gotten that question a lot, is, am I too old to get into cybersecurity? I kid you not, I probably get this question probably at least like 4 times a month. So I just want everyone to know none of that matters. Like, you can transition into the space, and it's one of those industries where you can leverage any pre-existing experience from just about any field, because if it involved a computer at any point, trust me, start dabbling, you'll see what I mean. So it's not getting into cybersecurity. It's a weird industry, but it's not necessarily as intimidating as you might think. And if for those of you who are new and want to know, like, how can I start from ground zero, message me and I'll help give you some things that'll help you start from, like, literally ground zero. So you don't have to know everything. You don't have to be a wizard, genius of the all-time universe or anything like that. So hopefully that has answered a lot of the questions of the week anyways. Does anyone have... Oh, good point. Someone is going to shoot for a government scholarship. And, you know, government scholarships, like, they're good too. Education in general, I do want to talk about education. Education in cybersecurity is the thing that helps you establish a lot more independence in the field. So, because that's a weird one. I have paid for obscene amounts of education to the point to where, I don't know, it pays itself back. I'll just say that. When you learn how foundations work and you learn how all the different aspects of technology work, and then you learn, you know, I have a business degree, communications degree. For whatever reason, I studied acting and got voice acting classes and all kinds of random stuff. That you get more independence when you start building more skills through knowledge, because then that way after a while you get enough skills to where you can kind of figure out how to do what you'd rather do, whether it's work for the type of company you'd prefer to work for or just start your own company. Having a lack of education, what I find is it's harder to figure out where your strengths lie and the things that you're going to really shine at. And so really to get to the point where you're starting to make a lot more money and get like roles you really like, that's a thing. And a question, am I familiar with DoD CYSCP or CyberCore SFS? Let me see real quick, because there's so many random acronyms in the... Oh, CyberCore. So many things out there that I'm sometimes familiar with. Oh yeah, scholarship programs. I'm not familiar with the Cyber Scholarship program specifically, but I am a person who's a believer in scholarships, so I always recommend going for scholarships if you have an opportunity to get one. I do find education to be a preferential thing. So some people prefer to go to college and learn that way, and others prefer to go learn on the job. And I find that within 10 years, from a financial standpoint, it really doesn't seem to matter. It's just that upfront, people who go to education tend to end up needing more money sooner, but then they make more money as soon as they start working sooner. And then by the time people get to a certain junction, so I guess they're all scholarships. So I'm not so familiar with those specific scholarships. But yeah, if you have an opportunity to get a scholarship, if you do like education and you like having like a structured format for how it's laid out to you, I do find that there are benefits to that for those who are drawn to like cybersecurity, learning through a more standardized, not so self-paced format. I'm a self-pacer. I have preferences to just kind of self-pace and self-teach just about everything, but I also know that my way of doing things tends to be really slow and tedious and lots of long-term planning that not everyone's really into. So yeah, scholarships are really great. I am a strong believer in education, so use those scholarships if you have, if it gives you something that you're interested in. One thing that I'm going to say about college that some people might not agree with is if you do start going to college and you've gotten like halfway through it, I still find that just as valuable as finishing if you're like, I don't know if XYZ is for me, because one thing that college does is it kind of lets you sample what you're getting into before spending like years to find out that you hate doing certain things. So, I mean, some people would rather find that out through getting the job, but once again, a lot of that's just honestly preferences, just trying to figure out like, what do you enjoy? The number one thing that will increase your income is finding something that you enjoy because of how our psychology works, not because of like, oh yeah, find what you're passionate. Well, to an extent there's that, but one real heavy hitter when it comes to trying to motivate yourself is that like our psychology is not innately like naturally motivated by anything but like whatever's like positive. So if you see something that looks positive, like you ate something that was good, motivation hits where you're just like, oh, I want more of whatever that thing that's good is. I want that thing. So if you are doing the type of work that you despise, you'll find that like your energy levels will deplete rapidly if you continue trying to force yourself to do things that you really don't like to do. And you might have been productive at first through discipline, but discipline has an expiration date. And if you understand that, discipline can be a powerful tool, but if you also understand that discipline has an expiration date if you're doing things you hate, you need to plan for that, for the fact that I will be able to focus on this thing that I despise doing for X amount of time, but after a while, you just end up staring at a screen, and any form of productivity that you once might have ever had for that thing tanks. And honestly, this is the thing that makes me not recommend people starting businesses oftentimes is people will start a business because they think that it's going to make them money, or for reasons other than like figuring out what motivates them. And then all of a sudden they have all these responsibilities, all of the other things that come with starting a business hit, and then they just regret the decision of starting a business, wonder why they did it, and then wish they'd done something completely different. If you're starting a business, you really don't want to do things that you don't like doing. You're better off getting a job so that when you do get burnt out, you still get paid when you're burnt out. The downside of burnout when you're running a company, you burn out when you're running a company, you're not getting PTO. You're not getting a check while you're sitting there for 8 hours staring at a screen. I remember when I worked at the lab, I would be like burnt out some days. You could spend like 2 weeks doing nothing as long as you showed up. Just like show up and be like, okay, I'm here. I made it. Yeah. And then you just like, we had a ping pong room and we had an arcade. So we'd be like, hey guys, you want to go play ping pong? We'd go longboarding too. Sometimes we would go down the lazy river, all kinds of stuff. Like that's what we did at work. We would have like yoga people come in. Like I don't even know when I did any work at that company anymore. Because ultimately it's like we're too busy playing ping pong. We were I don't know, longboarding and who knows what, and we went to like the Stanley Hotel and went on ghost tours and like all that stuff. Like, I mean, that was my cybersecurity time, doing like a lot of the time, and some of the, we did technical work too. But at a large company, they also know that if you're doing things you hate 24/7, if they don't do anything to drive motivation, they also know that time that we're watching the Avengers as a company, you're gonna be staring at that screen doing absolutely nothing anyways. So they're like, well, might as well give them an arcade, might as well give them some other stuff so that they kind of recover a little bit while they're in the office, so that they can get back to having enough like capacity to get some work done. So it's some weird business management, like trying to figure out how to make sure that the company can move forward and all that stuff. And it's crazy, it's complicated, but if you do start a company, you will find that trying to force motivation, it has an expiration date. So does anyone have any last questions about anything in particular? This week is kind of an in-between. Next week we're going to be announcing our case stuff a lot more, and not for Free Coaching Friday, but before Free Coaching Friday. And then we're going to have like a DevSecOps workshop day where I'm actually going to just do some like live build with me days. Those are going to be a new thing that we're going to be doing here soon. That won't be part of Free Coaching Friday. Free Coaching Friday is just stay more focused on the questions, the things of the week, and just trying to teach everyone something that's going to be helpful. And then remember, this week's homework is to reverse engineer Twister OS. And if you don't have a Raspberry Pi to throw Twister OS on, then you'll learn a similar lesson by trying to figure out how in the world you can get Twister OS working in a virtual machine. Because there's a way to get Twister OS working in a virtual machine. Oh yeah, so good question about explaining the homework. So to kind of go from the top for those who missed the previous homework assignment, something that I went over is the fact that software isn't universally compatible. So Steam, for example, if you ever use Steam, I don't even know if I have it open. I won't log in if it's not open yet. Oh, it doesn't matter. So Steam, I'll just go to steampowered.com. For those of you who know what Steam is, it is not compatible with a Raspberry Pi. And if you go and get like a Raspberry Pi and try to install Steam, the application, on Raspberry Pi. Here we go, it popped up. It's just not going to work. It won't launch. So last week I was focused on teaching how can you do development with ARM, because right now companies are focused on expanding adoption and making things compatible with more things and expanding user bases. And how do people expand user bases? They hire people who can make their software compatible with more things. And so with ARM being bought out, companies like Steam are going to be looking to make tools like Steam compatible with hardware like the Raspberry Pi, which is the ARM processors, the type of processor that a Raspberry Pi uses. So the homework was to try to get Steam running on a Raspberry Pi. Now that was last week. So this week, I'm going to have everyone take a look at an operating system for the Raspberry Pi that already has Steam built into it and running on there. And the purpose and point of this is that this is what's called multi-architecture engineering. There is a skill in making software work with something that it's not supposed to work. So I encourage you to install Twister OS and take a look at Steam, and maybe even try this. I would recommend maybe even trying uninstalling Steam on there and trying to rebuild it yourself. And then, just try it. You could try that again if you want to, but I want you this time to reverse engineer a pre-built Steam because Steam's not supposed to work on a Raspberry Pi. And so that's why I would like everyone to use Twister OS, and then I think I'll just paste that in the chat again real quick. So that is basically what I'd like you to do is just install Twister OS. Now, if you don't have a Raspberry Pi, you can actually try to find out how exactly can you get Twister OS running in a virtual machine. So then that's my homework for those who don't have a Raspberry Pi, is get Twister OS working on a virtual machine, because once again, this is ARM engineering. ARM, if we take a look at what ARM is, well, first let me just say Raspberry Pi 4. So if we go and take a look at a bunch of Raspberry Pi 4s, and I just click on any of these, it doesn't matter which one. If we take a look at this, like this little processor right here on the Raspberry Pi, this that silver chip in particular, that is an ARM processor. And so what I'm asking you to do is learn skills with ARM processors and learn how to work with software with ARM processors. And Twister OS is just a great way to do some reverse engineering and start to learn how to do some development with ARM. And so some other things that you can try later on, we'll get into that. Feel free to ask me for some other challenges, but right now I'm just going to leave everyone with that reverse engineering homework task with Twister OS. So good luck, and then if anyone has any extra questions, then yeah, I'll go ahead and answer more questions next week. And someone did bring up QEMU. For those who are wondering about Twister OS on a virtual machine, I'll give you the hint is QEMU, QEMU. It's a pretty interesting tool.